welcome back to another episode of the Paulitics Show. Today I'm joined by Town Councilman Justin Farmer, who's running for Connecticut Senate District number 17. Mr. Farmer, how are you?
I'm doing good. Thank you, Paul, for having me on. And hello to everyone who's going to be watching.
So would you be able to provide myself and the audience a little bit of who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so my name is Justin Farmer. I am 25 years young. I am an incumbent city councilor in Hamden, representing the 5th District. I ran 2.5 years ago at 23, ran in the primary, won by 23 votes, turned 23 the month before. And I really got radicalized politically, working on campaigns for school. So I had a political science teacher who told me, you know, if you're going to be studying this, you should work on a campaign. And at that time, and I consider myself an activist elected official, so worked with different community groups, Planned Parenthood, ULADA, working on documented rights, environmental groups, labor unions, but politics is like, that's not my thing. Don't like politicians, don't like politics. So he said, cool, you don't have to work on a campaign, but you can do like a research project and do like a 20-page paper. I was like, oh, I love politics. I'm definitely gonna go and knock on doors. So I actually knocked on part of the district. I knocked in Woodbridge. Woodbridge, Orange, and Milford, and got a great experience out there, and realized that, you know, despite being a different candidate, in the sense that, you know, I'm a student, so I'm a part-time student, I was like, yeah, I probably shouldn't run. You know, I don't have a mass amount of wealth or independently wealthy. You know, public transportation, I use public transportation, biking, buses, car rides, Lyft, Uber. I was like, maybe this is not the place for me. And I happen to have Tourettes. So I have, part of the reason why I wear noise canceling headphones is I'm sensitive to noise. So I'm like, you know, I'm a disabled man who is doing all these things. Maybe it's not best for me to be the face about talking about issues in my community. And after the election in 2016, I realized, like, cool, we have lots of work to do. I'm going to run an issues campaign and explain to my community where we need to work, because it's not just Trump running, it's us. Like, we have a ton of work to convince voters that we as a party have something to offer. So since then, I've been the highest vote getter in town. And yeah, actually, I want to be a marine biologist. So I always joke with people that, you know, my goal and aspiration is to get paid to play with fish. And politics and all these things, I'm like, all these institutional deficits, once we get them out of the way, I can focus on my passion of playing with fish. But in the meantime, I am in the political realm. My family immigrated from Jamaica. I'm the youngest of 5 siblings. They immigrated a decade before I was born. Live on the borderline of Hamden and New Haven, and my house was built on a toxic waste dump. So the neighborhood house that I live across the street from literally sunk into the ground and had to be knocked over my senior year of high school. And I'm actually working actively on trying to clean up this brownfield and make sure that we finish the work community activists started 20 years ago, to have economic equality in my neighborhood. So that's a little bit about me. I'm sure as we talk about policy and other stuff, I'll be able to share more about me, but that's me in a nutshell. Is that went to school, got radicalized through my experience with education and my disability, got into activism, did this class project for school credit, and then all of a sudden, like, oh, I'm an elected leader. It's like, when did this happen? Like, I was doing this to avoid a paper.
So before we get into the policy substance, I actually met you back in February when you came to Quinnipiac University, and you're very open about having Tourette's. Has that changed the way you campaign?
I would say so in a multitude of ways, because I think one of the things that you see is that, for me, sometimes people get thrown off by the idea of the headphones. And, you know, I'll walk into a room. I'm usually one of the youngest people in the room, and I'll walk into the room. Sometimes people are confused. And they're like, who's this guy? Like, what's his story? Like, why is he here? What is he doing? And by the end of the conversation, they're like, oh, you're an elected leader. Like, you have been leading for some time. You are not new. And they're like, oh, like, you are listening to me. You do understand the issues. And I think that perspective of just having those type of conversations and having empathy, where there have been one time I was talking to this woman in her 50s, 60s. She thought I was wearing the headphones being rude. And she saw me at different environmental events. And then, you know, someone that we knew who didn't know me too well asked me about the headphones. And I've known this woman maybe a year, 2 years. And this was maybe about 4 or 5 months ago. This mutual friend asked me, like, hey, why do you wear the headphones? And I explained, and this woman has suffered from a traumatic accident and has sensitivity to sound and to light. And by finding out about why I wear my headphones, she shared with me that she now will sometimes wear a hat when it's too bright out for her. She'll put on earmuffs when it's too loud out, just to protect herself and be able to move and navigate throughout the world. And like, that was something super powerful, where, you know, this is an elder, not elderly, but an elder sharing their perspective about how they appreciated that I just navigated the world with my truth. And I think that's something that's different from a lot of people that I work with, is that part of my disability makes it so that I can't hide who I am. I just have to, like, put it all on the table and say, this is who I am. These are the issues that are important for me, and this is why I have to advocate. And I think that is something that allows me to campaign differently, where we see it all the time, where politicians will hide aspects of their lives, and then it will come to light, and they'll be embarrassed or ashamed of it, where, you know, my logo is literally me wearing headphones. At some point, someone's going to have to ask, hey, what is that about? And that can give me the ability to share my perspective of, I'm not just fighting for transportation justice. I'm fighting for accessibility rights. And I understand that as a person with disability. When I'm talking about education, I could talk about how, you know, my experience of trying to get a $2,000 word processor, and how my school fought me because we haven't had the resources. And they basically hedged a bet of not spending resources on me because they didn't see the investment, because we're underfunded. And that is something that, you know, I feel having Tourette's and being open about it allows me to have many discussions that people normally would have. And it also allows people to, there's been so many times I have people come up to me and say, you know, my kid is in 7th grade, and we found out about you, and now they wear noise canceling headphones. Or, you know, my kid has some sensory issues, and based off of you talking about your experiences, we were able to do X, Y, and Z to help them with anxiety. And those are powerful things, where all I did was exist. I didn't do any grandiose speech. All I did was, this is who I am, and this is how I navigate. And it allows me to be invited into different work in different spaces.
So before we actually get into policy, I just want to make one quick comment. Your logo is fantastic. I'm going to put it on the screen right now. I saw it and I thought it was great. So just wanted to commend your team on that. But you're running in Senate District 17. Is there a moment that made you say George Logan, the incumbent, has to go?
So in that first campaign I worked on, I actually, the last couple of days of the campaign, I worked on Senator Crisco, the former Democratic senator for this district. I worked on his campaign for the last couple of days, and I could see that Senator Crisco had aged and wasn't able to knock as many doors. And in some ways, us as a party didn't have all the resources that we needed to hold on to the seat. And so when I met George Logan, he smiled and was very happy and bubbly and said all these flowery things. His family, he has Jamaican descendants as well. And I remember him talking about strengthening the Trust Act. There was a bill to strengthen it to prevent ICE from going into our courthouses, which is a big problem because it messes with due process. It doesn't foster trust in our community. It keeps undocumented people from coming forward when they see crimes. And he testified about why we shouldn't keep community members safe. And that was kind of like the first time I got upset. And then he came to that Keefe Community Center with Senator Vazano and cut a ton of programs unrelated to the community, but that would hurt my immediate community, went to the community center. So these senators never come to my community. This is only a couple of blocks from my house, one of the poorest neighborhoods in the state. And they came here to parade and pretend that they cared about the issues that were important to us. And that was the moment where I was just like, cool, I don't know what it's going to be, but I'm going to help to get rid of this guy. And last election cycle, I worked on Sean Grace's campaign. I worked on Cabrera's after the primary of Sean Grace. And this time, I said it was too important to not have someone really challenge Logan and really go bat to bat. And the thing that people like to say about Logan is that he shows up everywhere. And I have a track record of kind of being anywhere and everywhere across the state. So that's where I said, you know what? I have a unique ability and chance to mirror the issue and say like, cool, yes, you are a Black man. I am also a Black man. Yes, you show up everywhere. I also show up everywhere. This is your voting record. Here is my voting record. And I think those are the conversations that I want to see happen. And that's kind of why, when I saw that he went to the polls and said he was an independent to Democrats, and then he said he was a Republican to Republicans. And we need people to just be straight. If you're a Republican, cool. Tell me why you're the better choice for my community. If you're a Democrat, tell me why you're a better choice. If you're independent, cool. Pitch yourself. But people who are, trying to juggle multiple things and be everything to everyone, you're not being true to yourself.
On your website, you call for the implementation of a Green New Deal in Connecticut.
Yeah.
Would you be able to explain your position? Yeah.
So Green New Deal, lots of people have heard the terminology. People think of AOC. Actually, the Green New Deal started several years before her election. And it's the conversation about how we are planning for economic development. So I always tell people, I'm like, cool. I'm like, oh man, the Green New Deal, it's so scary. It's this, it's that. I'm like, all right, cool. What if I told you you already have a Green New Deal and you make one every 10 years? And people are like, what? I'm like, it's called your plan of conservation. Every town, every municipality, every 10 years has to make a plan of conservation. And they have to figure out, what are we going to do with economic development? What are our goals in terms of what type of industries we want to bring into our community? How are we going to protect our land and our natural water and our resources, our aquifers? And what infrastructure do we need to get there? The Green New Deal is just that, but also making sure you're having a just transition. And that means that you are building jobs and economy that are not extractive. So we're not going to build a new power plant or a new coal plant, but we're going to say, cool, what type of industries in the future are we going to bring in that are environmentally stable and that allow us to be good stewards to our land and our waterways? And it's as simple as that. And making those plans, and at the federal level, having federal dollars for these things to say, cool, you have a project and you have a plan of how you're going to improve economic development and protect your environment. The federal government, we will give you money to do that so that we don't have to pay for money to clean up brownfields. My community in Winchester gun factories left in the late 70s. The economic devastation of that industry and the gun manufacturers moving out of my neighborhood are still felt late today, 50 years later. And the same with the valley, with all these industrial areas. So instead of having these brownfields that we have to spend millions of dollars paying for, we have a green bank in Connecticut. Let's take that money, figure out, cool, let's have solar farms. Let's train people to do retrofitting of solar plants, something that we could do in the regional tri-state area and have professionals go between New York, Boston, and our neighboring communities to do this work. Let's focus on undergrounding wires. We had the tornado and that knocked out power across the state. Let's teach people these skills that they're going to need to know and train people in job development for the jobs we're going to need to combat climate change. So that is my vision and perspective of what a Green New Deal means. And it's making sure that the money from the Green Bank is not just going to shoreline communities like Bridgeport or Madison, but communities like the Naugatuck River. The debris that is in the river, if we're going to dam up the river already, we can talk about creating hydroelectric power. We can talk about retrofitting things to have fishways. We can change the geography and change commerce. Talk about what type of transportation we want to bring in that doesn't harm the environment. So that is my perspective of what a Green New Deal for Connecticut is to actually focus and say, what do we want to accomplish in the next decade in our state? And what are we investing in things that we're going to have to pay for down the line? Like our highway project, where the governor wants to put up tolls and then expand highways. That's infrastructure that we have to pay for down the line. That is extractive industries that actually hurt the environment? Or are we going to think about things that are restorative and that add value?
Typically, the Green New Deal on the federal level, and I'm sure on the state level too, is plagued with this notion that, well, how are you going to pay for it?
Yeah.
So, if you've ever watched a video on CNN or MSNBC, I have to ask you, because this is a progressive proposal, how are you going to pay for it?
Yeah, we have a green bank in Connecticut. So we have $80 million in our green bank, which is private public partnership, where we have public dollars and we have industries putting money together to address some of these issues. One of the first in the country, and every year the legislature says they are penny wise, pound foolish. So they say, cool, we didn't properly budget, we didn't properly think about our expenses, so let's rob the green fund millions of dollars, pay for stuff that we should have planned to pay for, and then not invest in the future. Every dollar we spend, we can save $4 or $5 down the line, a year to 5 years down the line. So for me, I'm just like, cool. If we have a problem because we didn't pay our pensions for 20 years, That means first we need to pay our bills, and then all the amenities and everything else that we want to do after, we have to prioritize what's most important. And when we know Connecticut is a coastal state, that is something that has to be a priority. The longer and longer we wait to address climate change, the more of an impact it has for us, and the more it has an impact for taxpayers. When Hurricane Sandy happened, we had communities across the shoreline. You still have people's homes who have not been refurbished from the hurricane back in 2011. I have community members who got hit with the tornado a year and a half now ago, and they still are not back in their homes. So the state is going to pay for it one way or another. The question is whether we have the political will to defer some programs and to pay down some debt now and invest in the future, or do we just want to have it all and then continue to rob the green bank? So Connecticut is different and unique in the sense that we literally have millions of dollars sitting. It builds up interest and it creates more money, and then the legislature steals the money to pay for other stuff. I'm just like, that's disingenuous. If you don't want to have a green fund, don't have one. But if you have money for a specific cause and you're always using it for something else, then you really shouldn't be budgeting for it.
So I next want to begin talking about this criminal justice reform that's on your website. And on your website, it reads, activists are now rallying to defund the police and prisons and invest in fighting the real sources of crime, poverty, and inequality. Do you agree with those activists that we should defund the police?
I feel, so I would say the police agree with defunding the police. If you talk to law enforcement, they talk about all the time that they are not equipped to deal with social emotional issues. So me, I'm just like, instead of spending money, if you, let's say for Woodbridge, for instance, you put money aside for a social worker in Woodbridge to respond to nonviolent complaints, to do wellness checks. That social worker could spend an 8-hour shift, right? Go to work. Maybe they don't have anyone that they have to deal with today, but tomorrow someone has a mental breakdown. They then follow up with them the next day. They help connect them to resources around the state. They help them figure out a treatment plan. That is so much more valuable than to have police respond to someone in mental crisis over and over and over again until that person spirals out of control, and then either the police overreact or, God forbid, they underreact. Then people will, either way, they'll say, why did the police do that? They don't have the skills and training and the tools to address these issues. So it's time for us to focus and have people who are trained to focus on the issues be the expert. We do this for everything else. It would make sense to start thinking in that way. UConn, right now you have UConn University. They're cutting a ton of athletic sports, cutting a ton of things. The president of UConn is talking about hiring more police. In a time when communities, we always talk about community policing. When you have communities asking for less police and they want to put their taxpayer dollars and their money towards other things, that should be respected as part of community policing. So for me, part of it is, yes, we need to reallocate funds for certain things. The other part is community responsibility. We had a police shooting here in Hamden, and you heard me talk about it. I've been arguing for a civilian review board with subpoena powers for 13, 14 months now. Having an elected body of public safety experts, and I say experts in the sense of having qualifications to be on the police commission, people who have expertise or work with youth and children, people who work in the medical field, so that they can make the decisions and say, these are the type of reforms we need in our system, and this is what we need to think about, be cognizant of in our community. So I agree that there needs to be wholesale reform, and part of that has to be money. People always say talk is cheap. If we're serious about having peace and keeping peace, then we need to reinvest into our communities the things that we need. We can't say, we want our schools to be safe and not have nurses, but then have student resource officers. Like, those two things are in juxtaposition to each other. So yeah, in simplicity, yes.
You talk about legalizing marijuana, which is something I agree with. And you also state that it's time to decriminalize drug addiction. What do you mean by this?
Well, we need to decriminalize drug addiction. Right now, we have people who are in pretrial jail because of petty drug crimes. And in a time of Corona, not only does that make inmates unsafe, but that makes correction officers unsafe. That makes communities unsafe, because these correction officers work, live in our communities. So we need to decriminalize simple things like that. Portugal has an amazing model where they've decriminalized most drugs, and they say, cool, you can use drugs, and if you use them responsibly, power to you, so on and so forth. That if you have a problem, if you get yourself in trouble, if you are under the influence and you are driving or you're doing something that puts lives in danger, cool, we mandate that you meet with a job coach and you meet with a life coach, and we talk about addiction, and we figure out and we create a plan for you to be successful. Those are the type of innovations that we need to have. And Portugal, a decade ago, had a staggering crime rate. And since implementing such changes, their crime rate has plummeted. Their budget for law enforcement has gone down because they don't need as many police cracking down on crime, because people are being more responsible and they're putting the resources where they need to be. And before, they had to deal with gangs or drug dealers, this and this and that. Now, for the most part, they have a minimal addiction rate. They're leaders in the nation. So we need to start thinking about innovations like that. Marijuana is something that, many parts of the country are already legalizing it. Every state around Connecticut has legalized. It's time for us to get that revenue and put it towards restoring and rebuilding our communities, and not just say, cool, we're going to sweep it into the general fund, but to be wise about how we're collecting that money and where it goes to. So if we know we have problems with drug addiction, or we know we have problems with crime, put part of that money towards crime. Put that money towards communities that have been hit hard by the war on drugs and that have been struggling. A community like the Valley, where a ton of industries have left, instead of just saying we're going to legalize it and put it anywhere, let's open dispensaries in the Valley and say, cool, this is an opportunity to build commerce. Restaurants, stores, supply chains that build around this economy, cool. You need to come to this geographic area that has had resources extracted from it. And now this is the starting point of where legalization can start. And all of a sudden, you don't have to think about how you attract people to, if you legalize marijuana and said the only dispensaries are going to be in Killingly, Connecticut, I bet you tomorrow industry and people would figure out, how are we going to get people to Killingly, Connecticut? How are we going to attract people to this place? Well, you would have developers coming to you figuring out how to bring business there, because they know people have an interest. And those are the type of things and innovation we as leaders in Connecticut need to start thinking about, rather than just saying drugs are bad. Yes, but how are we going to prevent? If the issue is public safety, then we need to think about it from a public safety standpoint and not from a standpoint of legal versus illegal.
I want to ask one last question, and this refers to your general campaign. Is there a particular policy that you believe to be necessarily the highlight of your campaign?
I would argue, taxing the rich, taxing big pharma, and tech companies. We know that we don't have fair taxation in this state. We know how that affects our communities. When you're talking about a community like the Valley, that on average is aging in terms of other communities in the state, we need tax revenue. We are alliance districts. The state, by their own formulation, by their own calculation, says, we know your community needs more money for your schools. We know you need more money because, car taxes aren't equal. So we're going to do wonky formulas to give you part of that money back. So we know that we have a deficit and that it's too regressive to ask taxpayers to pay for something that has generational deficits and neglect from government. So this is something that, the federal level, there's conversations on how you can tax companies, but the Supreme Court has ruled. You have rulings and you have decisions that states can tax companies in different ways than the federal government can. And because we can do that, we can tax tech giants like Facebook and say, cool, you're collecting people's data and information. You're doing business in the state of Connecticut. You have to pay your fair share to do that business. Facebook isn't going to say, you know what? We can't afford to pay taxes, so we're just not going to have Facebook in Connecticut anymore. That's not a real thing. They're going to pay their fair share. And that's a way of, instead of going after the Gold Coast that arguably needs to be paying more of their fair share, this is a way to bring in revenue in a way that's not regressive. That doesn't chase away millionaires, although I would argue that we can tax, Fairfield County without having people run away. It's having people pay their fair share, do their obligation to be responsible community members. But this is another way of talking about how business is done in Connecticut and to combat the cost of living. Because all the issues that I'm talking about, all the things I want to do, to your point, people's number one question is, where's the money? How are you going to pay for it? And that's a reasonable question, especially when people are paying higher taxes and getting less. I'm like, yeah, we need to think about ways of getting revenue and attractive industry into our state in a way that we're not putting that debt on the backs of the shoulders of the, most vulnerable people first in need in our community. And I think that, my opponent unequivocally started this campaign and said, yes, we need to tax the rich. Something that it took my opponent time to say. And when they realized, like, oh, we can talk about these issues, like, yes, that's the fact. We can, as Democrats, can talk about our issues and share our truth. And if we articulate a plan and a way to do it, there's going to be some people who disagree, but most people, if they think they're serious about something, they see a plan, they can rock with it. And that's where, I feel like that is the cornerstone of the campaign, where progressive legislation is great, talking about social issues is great, but, again, we're having people who are dealing with generational consequences, generational debt. And because my municipality, just like the state, didn't pay our pension obligations for 20 years, that has consequences. That's not something that you and I can, just work hard, pay our taxes and get out of. That's something that we have to be creative and innovative to be able to catch up, unless we're going to wait for 20 years of paying our debt to catch up. But that's 2 generations of community members paying for the sins of the past. So I think that sets the campaign apart differently, about having some of these conversations about how, I would argue people at the General Assembly aren't talking about the effect of TikTok and Instagram and Facebook and how they affect our economy. And if we're not having those conversations, then we're not keeping up with, the trends of today, and we're not keeping up with, attracting commerce to our state.
Is there any last thing you'd like to say before we end today's episode?
The only last thing I'd like to say, this has been a grassroots campaign. You know, we were able to raise $20,000 by the average contribution is $24. We're in the Citizens Election Program, so we raised all our money. Our kickoff, we had over 100 people come out to our campaign kickoff. We got on the ballot for August 11th. So this is a huge deal. Like, our campaign, our candidacy has been something that, people questioned at first whether it was possible to have a candidacy, to have an activist elected official, to be in this space. But I like to remind people, experience matters. I have more legislative experience. I've been battle tested. I've worked on legislation. I've worked with community groups. And that's where we need to start thinking about, how we plant the seeds of change for a better future in Connecticut. So I hope people will fill out the absentee ballot forms so that they can safely receive an absentee ballot. And I hope that they cast their vote for me come August 11th.